Okay, guys, so we're going to move on to the executive branch. We did the legislative branch, that's Congress, that's Article 1 of the Constitution. Now we have the executive branch, Article 2 of the Constitution. This includes the president. So the qualifications to become the president. The formal qualifications are he has to be 35 years old, a natural born citizen, and a U.S. resident for 14 years. Notice it does not say anything about gender, does not say anything about a criminal record, does not say anything about education level or anything like that. It just gives you 3 formal qualifications. So what is a natural born citizen? That's anybody born in the United States, anybody born outside the United States, both of whose parents are citizens of the US, as long as one parent has actually lived inside the United States. Anyone born outside the United States if one parent is a citizen and lived in the US for at least 1 year. Anyone born in a U.S. possession if one parent is a citizen and lived in the U.S. for at least 1 year. Anyone found in the U.S. under the age of 5 whose parentage cannot be determined, as long as proof of non-citizenship is not provided by age 21, and anyone born outside the United States if one parent is an alien, and as long as the other parent is a citizen of the United States who lived in the U.S. for at least 5 years, with military and diplomatic service included. So there are informal qualifications. These are just the things that have been common throughout all the presidents. They've all shared similar characteristics. They're mostly white males, except for Barack Obama. Protestant, we only had 1 Catholic, which was John F. Kennedy. Now Joe Biden is also Catholic, so we will have 2 Catholic presidents. They typically have British ancestry. Most attended college, and they had careers as lawyers. Then we have evidence of change. 1960, JFK became the first Catholic president. In 1984, the Democratic Party nominated Geraldine Ferraro as the first vice presidential candidate. This should be first female vice presidential candidate. In 1988, Jesse Jackson became the first African American to come in a close second in the race for the Democratic presidential nomination. Salary and benefits. So starting in 1789, the president only made $25,000 a year. But in $1789, that's a lot of money. And it wasn't until 2001 when he got a significant pay raise from 1969 of $200,000. So now the president makes $400,000 a year. Benefits, they receive $50,000 a year for expenses and up to $100,000 a year for travel. The salary cannot be changed during the term, and there's free lodging at the White House and Camp David, which is like a vacation home. This is Camp David right here. President and family receive finest medical care possible and personal protection, which is the Secret Service. The president has a plane, Air Force One, and a personal helicopter, which is Marine One, at his disposal. Election in terms of office. Elections are held every 4 years, and the president elected by an electoral college. The candidate with the most electoral votes wins the election. So you just saw this with Joe Biden and Donald Trump with the fight for the electoral college and who gets the most electoral votes. Electoral votes are determined by state populations. So terms of office, 4 years equals 1 presidential term. The Constitution originally placed no limit on the number of presidential terms. George Washington established a tradition when he stepped down after 2 terms. However, FDR bucked the trend. In 1940, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, became the first president to not step down after a 2nd term. He was instead elected 4 times. This happened through the Great Depression and World War II. In 1951, after he died in 1945, the 22nd Amendment was added to the Constitution, which limits the president to 2 consecutive terms. Presidential succession. So what happens if the president dies? In 1841, William Henry Harrison became the first president to die while in office. Vice President John Tyler set a tradition by declaring himself president. In 1967, the 25th Amendment turned tradition into law, which says if the presidency is vacant, the VP becomes president and then appoints his own VP, which is vice president. Since ratified, the 25th Amendment has been used 3 times. In 1973, VP Spiro Agnew resigned, and President Nixon replaced him with Gerald Ford. In 1974, President Nixon resigned and Gerald Ford became president. And then in 1985, President Reagan was shot, and during surgery, his vice president, George Bush, became president for 8 hours. 8 US presidents have died in office. 1947, Congress passed the Presidential Succession Act, which indicates the order of succession to the presidency. So here's the long line of succession. So if the president dies, it goes to the vice president. If they both die, it goes to the Speaker of the House. And then if all 3 of them die, it goes to the president pro tempore of the Senate, and then you can see on the way down. But the likelihood of even getting to the Speaker of the House is very, very minimal. Presidential roles. There are 7 major roles of the president. First, he's a chief executive. He carries out the nation's laws. He issues executive orders, which is to rule or command the president issues that has the force of law, usually during times of crisis. He appoints cabinet members, ambassadors, judges, heads of government agencies. He's a chief diplomat, responsible for making treaties with other countries with the Senate approval. There's that checks and balances. He meets with foreign leaders. He can make executive agreements with leaders of other countries, which have the force of law but do not require Senate approval. He's also responsible for appointing ambassadors, which is basically delegates to other countries of goodwill and keeping tabs on other people, an official representative of a country's government with Senate approval. He's the commander-in-chief. The president is the final authority over all military matters. Founding fathers believed in civilian control over the military, and the person elected by the people has final say over all military matters. The president can use military in times of war or peace. For example, in 1957, President Eisenhower sent federal troops into Little Rock, Arkansas, when attempts to integrate public schools led to violence between locals and police. And here you see President Barack Obama with his Joint Chiefs of Staff. They're represented by all the different branches of the military. Stretching of this power by former presidents has led to legislation limiting the president's power over the military. For example, President Truman sent troops to fight in Korean War, but we never actually declared war. And the same thing happened in Vietnam with Presidents Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon sent troops to Vietnam, but the Congress never declared war. The 1973 War Powers Act, passed by Congress, says the president must notify Congress when troops are sent anywhere. Troops must be brought home after 60 days unless Congress declares war or gives approval for troops to stay. The president is also his political party leader. He supports party members in election campaigns and helps unify the party. He appoints members of the party to key government jobs. He's also the legislative leader. He proposes legislation and uses many tactics to get bills passed through the Congress. He prepares the presidential budget and approves or vetoes legislation. He's also the judicial leader. He appoints judges to federal courts and the U.S. Supreme Court. He appoints justices whose viewpoint is similar to their own, typically. The president can issue pardons, reprieves, and amnesty to those convicted of federal crimes. A pardon is a declaration of forgiveness and freedom from punishment. A reprieve is an order to delay a person's punishment until a higher court can rule on the case, usually a death sentence. Commutation substitutes a less severe punishment for the one originally imposed by the court. And amnesty is the same as a pardon and applies to a group of people rather than an individual. He's also the chief of state. This role is mostly symbolic. The president is representing people from all 50 states. This gives a human face to the American government, and it can be demonstrated in many ways by greeting heroes, throwing first pitches at baseball games, inviting musicians to perform at the White House, attending the funeral of another country's leader or past presidents of the United States, and also giving speeches and having ceremonies. So you see the first pitch, greeting heroes when they come back, dead or alive, unfortunately, funeral processions, and greeting heroes on the front lines. The vice president. Qualifications, same as the president. Duties and responsibilities, he serves as the president of the Senate, which is his only constitutional duty. The president delegates out many responsibilities to the VP, like taking part in presidential cabinet meetings, helping with diplomatic relations with other countries, advising and helping the president make important decisions. So here you see Joe Biden when he was Obama's vice president. The salary and benefits, they make $198,000 a year. They receive $10,000 a year for expenses, and other benefits similar to the president's, such as free residence, a large staff, and a variety of personal services, including Secret Service protection. The original procedure for electing a vice president was that the Electoral College members in each state voted for two candidates for president. The candidate with the most votes became the president, and the runner-up became the vice president. After a tie of 1800, the procedure changed. The 12th Amendment was done, which says that electoral votes for president and vice president on separate ballots. The VP term of office is not limited, although no VP has ever served more than 2 terms. So now I have 2 videos to show you. The first one kind of gives you an overview of what is the executive branch. Make sure my sound is on. It's not.
There are 3 branches of government in the U.S. legislative, executive, and judicial. The president heads the executive branch and has unique powers, including executive orders, vetoes, appointing federal judges, and appointing the heads of federal agencies, also known as the president's cabinet. He also acts as the commander-in-chief of the military. The cabinet, itself part of the executive branch, also acts as an advisory board to the president, with the chief executive of each agency, mostly known as the secretary of their department. The president doesn't have absolute power to make these appointments. The Senate must vote to confirm the president's appointees, one example of the checks and balances at work. Cabinet members also make up part of the presidential line of succession in the event that the current president becomes incapacitated, resigns, dies, or is removed from office. First in line is the vice president, then the Speaker of the House, and then the Senate president pro tempore. After that, we start down the line of cabinet members. The president also appoints the heads of more than 50 independent federal commissions, as well as ambassadors and federal judges. Of course, those nominees need to be confirmed by the Senate as well, check and balance. But the president also checks Congress. When Congress enacts bills, the president either signs the legislation into law or rejects it through a veto. The president also has the power to pardon and grant clemencies for federal crimes, except in cases of impeachment, on both the state and federal level. In the global sphere, the president serves as the nation's representative. He can negotiate and sign treaties with another nation, but it only becomes ratified with the support of 2/3 of the Senate. The president also has the power to issue executive orders, which allows him to direct the actions of members of the executive branch without it having to be approved by Congress. But while Congress has no say when it comes to executive orders, the judicial branch, in the form of the Supreme Court, does have the power to overturn an executive order. But considering how much power the president is given, the eligibility requirements for the office of the presidency aren't very strict. The Constitution lists only 3 requirements. The president must be 35 years of age, a natural-born citizen, and must have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. Presidents are limited to 2 4-year terms, as stipulated by the 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951. Before that, 2 terms was traditionally the limit until President Franklin Delano Roosevelt served 4. In the US, we elect a new president every 4 years through a system called the Electoral College. This means when we go to the polls to vote for president, we actually vote for electors who will cast their vote on our behalf. While all of these rules or stipulations may sometimes befuddle us, they reflect how important maintaining a balance of power was to our founding fathers. So while the president's power has expanded as the United States has grown as a force on the world stage, the judicial and legislative branches still keep the leader of the free world in check.
All right, the next video I'm going to show you, if it'll let me, talks about the powers of the president.
Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Killen. I have my own medical practice,
Not this
and
one.
I've been using Doodly now for a few.
This episode of Crash Course is brought to you by Squarespace.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to talk about the most powerful person in the U.S. No, not Chris Hemsworth, although he is powerful in a physical sense. We're talking about the President of the U.S., who right now is Barack Obama, but that's the last we'll mention him specifically. Instead, we'll examine the office of the presidency and what makes whoever holds the office so powerful. We're also going to talk about what makes him, and so far the president has always been a him, less powerful than you might think. So you might have noticed a trend in these episodes that we like to start with what the Constitution says about the branches of government. That's not just because it's what appears on tests or what strict constructionist Justice Scalia would want us to do. We start with the Constitution because it gives us a formal description of the branch, in this case the executive, upon which we can build. What do you mean, upon which we can build? That's nonsense. The Constitution is a limited document. It lays the framework and the rules, and that's all. All this extra stuff is an unconstitutional power grab. Oh, clone from the right. I was wondering what happened to you clones. That's a good point you make, but really, the world is more complicated than it was in 1787, and we need to have a more flexible government. The Constitution provides a framework for understanding it, but it needs to change with the times. Besides, if the president becomes more powerful than what's suggested in the Constitution, whose fault is that? Congress. That's who. Okay, clones, we get the picture. There's a debate about the role of the Constitution in setting up the government, and we're not going to solve it today. For now, we're going to start with the Constitution and what it says about the president. You win this round, clone from the right. All right, let's try to keep those convos in the clone zone going forward. Thank you. Anyway, as with Congress, the Constitution lays out certain qualifications for the presidency. If you want to be president of the U.S., and I know you do, you must be 35 years old, which in the 1780s was actually pretty old. You were expected to have moved out of your parents' house by that point. And you must be a citizen of the U.S. who was born in the United States or one of its territories. The president is not elected directly by the American people. Yeah, your mind is blown. In the Constitution, as originally written, only members of the House of Representatives were directly elected by qualified citizens. The president is actually chosen by the Electoral College, which is complicated and frustrating for many Americans, and we're not going to go into it now, except to say that the reason it exists is that the framers didn't trust the popular vote all that much. So they built in the Electoral College as a safeguard against the people electing scary demagogues, or the person they wanted elected. Some people say that this is not particularly democratic, mostly because it's not particularly democratic. So democratically elected or not, the president is pretty powerful, but he has different categories of powers. What are they? First, he has military powers to send soldiers in planes and ships to do military things. He also has judicial powers in that he appoints federal judges and Supreme Court judges, subject to Senate approval, of course. He's the nation's chief diplomat, which is the source of his foreign policy power. The president can also propose laws, although he has to get a congressman or senator to actually introduce them into Congress. This is a legislative power. And since he's the chief executive, he also has executive power, which means that he's supposed to ensure that the laws are carried out. This is his most far-reaching power, probably because it's the least well-defined. Executive power is a pretty big deal, so we're going to give that its own episode. Another way to describe the president's powers is as either formal or informal. Formal powers are the ones we can find in the Constitution itself, mainly in Article 2. The informal powers come either from Congress or the president himself, but for now, let's look at the formal powers, which, like those given to Congress, are also known as express powers. Let's go to the thought bubble. Unfortunately, presidents don't derive their powers from the sun, like Superman, or from exposure to radiation, like the Fantastic Four or the Hulk. Their powers come from the Constitution, which, again, unfortunately, doesn't have any supernatural or mystical power, although some people like to think it does. The first power given to the president in the Constitution is that he is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which at the time was just the Army and Navy, since there were no airplanes. There's a reason why this should be the first power. If there's one thing that almost everyone can agree on, it's that the first job of government is to keep its citizens safe, especially from foreign invasion. The U.S. has had a lot of generals become president. Washington, Jackson, William Henry Harrison, Taylor, Grant, Eisenhower, and many others have served in the military, but only one president has led the U.S. troops in the field while he was president, and that was George Washington. The Whiskey Rebellion. That's something worth fighting over. The president has diplomatic powers, although he doesn't actually do most of the diplomacy. The president has the power to make treaties, which are mostly written by the State Department officials, but he takes credit. He appoints ambassadors and those State Department officials I just mentioned. His most visible foreign policy power is to receive ambassadors, which not only makes for great photo opportunities, selfie, but also is a significant power because receiving an ambassador effectively means recognition of that ambassador's country's existence. So the president can actually legitimize a nation state. Maybe he does have superpowers. The Constitution requires that the president from time to time inform Congress of the State of the Union. This takes the form of an annual State of the Union address. Historically, presidents did this in writing, although George Washington made a formal address. We have Woodrow Wilson to thank for reviving the practice of making the State of the Union an actual speech, which now appears on television early each year. This may not seem like much of a power, but the State of the Union is a chance for the president to set a policy agenda for the next year, and it can put some pressure on Congress to make policies. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the president has a couple of other powers we've already talked about. The president has a formal legislative power to veto laws passed by Congress. He also has the power to convene Congress into special sessions. The president also has judicial powers. He can appoint judges, but only with the consent of the Senate. He does have the power to grant pardons and reprieves, which doesn't sound like a big deal unless you're in jail or threatened by criminal prosecution, in which case it's a very big deal. So there you have it. Those are the formal constitutional powers of the President of the United States. You may have noticed that there aren't all that many of them, which is kind of the point. The framers of the Constitution wanted a limited government, one that couldn't oppress the people. They were especially afraid of a strong executive like a king in charge of a standing army, so they deliberately tried to curtail his powers by not giving him very many. But as we'll see in the next few episodes, over the course of the last 240 years or so, the powers of the president have expanded far beyond what the framers probably envisioned. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. I can feel my powers expand.
All right, so now what you're going to do is go into your modules. And complete the reading essentials, the discussion questions, and the quizzes.